Thank you for participating today. This pandemic has reminded us how important it is not to take life for granted and to take good care of each other and make the best out of these challenging times. And it's amazing to see how fast we have adapted to this new reality. And in NFI, our differentiator is having the right people connected, people with the right attitude, people who care about each other, and people that want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And during this crisis, we have shown that the trust and friendship we have keep moving us forward. Since NFI began, Chris Skinner, NFI's chairman, has been our inspiration, cornerstone, and connector. He guides us to find the right and relevant topics for all. And we've been working together with Chris to evolve and improve the activities for this year. Our continuous focus is to give value to the NFI members. And that is why the NFI member meetings and initiatives are continuing as digital meetings. We are planning eRound tables for new verticals, real estate, and insurance. And the first session of our sustainability conference will be June 4th. And finally, we will soon introduce you to new initiatives through the NFI Connect platform. We will keep you posted with all the news. All this work is because we never stop believing in the capabilities of the NFI network bringing the Nordics together. And the response for today's meeting is a clear proof. We have in the audience executives and experts, not only from the Nordics, but from all Europe. So thank you for being here today. And I invite you to do together what we do best: connect, think, and do. And now, welcome to our very own Chris Skinner, who will moderate this amazing panel of Nordic and European speakers. Thank you very much, Chris, for making this happen. Thank you.
So hello, I'm Christina Wejshammar, unfortunately not in moving image, but I'm working at the Riksbank, the Swedish central bank, heading our payments department, so in charge of both electronic and physical payments, both infrastructure and payment instruments.
Robin Hjelte. I'm head of analytics for SWISH. I've been working with SWISH for about a year. Previous to that, I used to work in the media industry. Maybe just briefly introduce SWISH as well. We're the method of payment in Sweden, especially when it comes to peer-to-peer payments. We are a real-time account-to-account payment service. We started in 2012 and have grown considerably over the years, now covering 90% of the Swedish population in the age span 18 to 70. So we have 7.2 million users. Most of them are active in a given month. And we're expecting to reach about 2 billion payments total towards the end of this year, but roughly 500 to 600 million payments per year, both P2P and B2C.
There we go. Rasmus Figenschou. So I work in DNB and responsible for an area called payments and innovation. So everything related to the payments area on the strategic side and driving change in that area, obviously relevant to this discussion, in addition to group responsibilities such as open banking, innovation management within our bank, New Tech Lab, which is a group of technical leads who drive change both in and outside the bank. Recently, having worked with a compensation agreement or compensation solution in Norway, that platform. Happy to touch upon that later. And also looking at new business models and strategic partnerships.
Sorry, thanks, Chris. Great to be here to provide a bit to the continental European perspective, apparently. So my employer is the Dutch Payments Association, where I'm Deputy General Manager. But I spend also a lot of time, that's my daytime job, but I spend a lot of time in Brussels, where I, for instance, chair the Payment Systems Committee of the European Banking Federation, sit on the board of the European Payments Council and some other stuff. So I spend a lot of time in Brussels and have a pretty good overview of what goes on in payments in Europe in general. And well, again, great to be here, and I hope that we have an inspiring conversation.
So I'm working with Norway, responsible for the banking, the market for personal customers, and working with the digital and daily value offering mobile bank to payments, bank.
Okay, well, hopefully my sound will sustain. I've not had a problem with Zoom before with my sound, so I don't know what's going on here. Maybe it's because I'm in the Northern Lights, but I wanted a Nordic theme. And I think one of the big things for me is during the crisis so far, we've discovered that we can all connect globally digitally. And we were all connected digitally before, but we used to do it maybe on Twitter or LinkedIn, whereas now we are all connecting on video. So one massive behavioural shift has already occurred, which is moving everybody to connect like this. In December 2019, Zoom had 10 million participants, 10 million. Now at the end of March, they had increased to 300 million. So a 30-fold increase in video users in just 3 months. And I think that illustrates not only the power of the shift of behaviors, but equally the power of cloud computing, because there's no way you could scale like that without cloud. One of the things I'm seeing with the banks is they've suddenly decided, literally almost overnight, that cloud is okay. Whereas for years, they've been debating about the risk of cloud and the risk of people accessing their services from home, for example. Whereas now everybody's working from home. So the world has changed dramatically in a very short time. And in this discussion, what I wanted to do is explore several themes. One is around what we see as maybe behavioral changes that are long-term, particularly in context of payments. How will people change as consumers and businesses in their relationship with their bank and the way in which they pay and the way in which they use money and deal with netting and rounding and pooling and settlement. But equally on the wider picture, maybe towards the second half of the discussion, a look at how we might see the financial industry overall changing and how some of the startups, the fintechs, might impact banking because of the way in which we've moved to digital engagement very rapidly. And I know that Christina from the Riksbank has to leave at 3 o'clock. So maybe Christina, even though we can't see you, you could give an introduction around those themes and your views, and then we'll get the other guys to respond.
So there were actually 3 things that I put down when I started thinking about about these themes. And the first thing that comes to mind is that how visible it is that a crisis accentuates the trends that are already going on. But just like you mentioned, using the cloud, which was, I mean, in normal times, you have a large amount of time to consider whether to do or whether not to do. when the crisis occurs, you just do because you're under the impression that you have to. So what we're seeing is that also in payments, trends that were there for a long time are now being even stronger. That comes both for physical cash usage and also for electronic payments, of course. So being far apart and not being able to go into shops and be in the city center, people are using electronic payment services, shopping from home. We saw the card schemes raising the limit for contactless payments. We've also seen, of course, that cash is less used. So that's the first thing that came to my mind. The second one is whether this accentuation of this trend is going to go on, or if we've come to a new stage and we're going to stay there, or if the longer the crisis goes on and the longer time that we are physically distanced from each other, if this is even going to go on even more, become even more clearer. And the third thing is really a question. So it's obvious, and you see very quickly how people's behaviors when it comes to how you pay and what payment instrument you use, how that has changed. Less obvious is, at least for me, whether this in the short or middle term run will also impact the kind of payment flows that are instant, so that moves into instant flows of payments instead of different kinds of deferred payments. So whether that trend as well is going to be clearer and faster, that's so far a question mark for me. I'm sure some of the other panelists can answer that question.
Yeah, I'll get some of the other panelists to build on their views, but one thing I wanted to pick up on, and I wanted to ask you and Robin this question, but Christina, maybe you could begin, is that from the media perspective, everybody said that Sweden didn't lock down. So has that meant that from a financial and payment perspective, it's just continued as normal, or have things changed?
No, things have changed. So for example, we've seen that when it comes to the use of cash, we've seen that from the beginning of March, there was first a kind of a certain raise in the amount of cash that was withdrawn from ATMs. But after those first two weeks, it's gone down. So rather the amount and the number of withdrawals from ATMs has reduced. And as well, of course, use of electronic means of payments have risen, although I don't have any figures there. I think when it comes to the question that Sweden has chosen a different path than the rest of the world, when you listen to the experts in public health, they say we're not that different. From a personal perspective, I would say that we're probably a bit different, but since we're also applying the physical distancing, although we're not forced to, but we are applying it. So what you see is that commerce has moved from city centers and shopping malls to the areas where people live, because that's where many people now also work. So and people are less inclined to go into shops. Many more people are trying to purchase things from homes, getting home deliveries, and of course, probably also reducing their commercial activities overall a bit. So I disagree that we're very different, and I would strongly underline that we have seen changes in the payment patterns.
Yeah, I'm fairly sure, Robin, you can build on that from a SWISH perspective, because you all have seen the numbers and volumes.
Yes, for sure. As we handle a lot of real-time, sort of really personal payments, we could of course see an immediate shift, pretty much from one day to another. I think early to mid-March, we could see a clear drop in payments around lunchtime, for example. Shared lunches a lot less common. An immediate drop in travel, both commuting travel as well as regional travel, and obviously international travel as well. So there was the most precipitous drop, and that happened pretty much over. I wouldn't say overnight, but as people settled in with working from home, we could really see that happen. There's another effect in Sweden that we haven't seen as an immediate drop, but rather a sort of a lack of activity. And that's what happens around springtime, where we see usually this time of year see a surge in activity with flea markets, sporting events, kids gatherings. I mean, people just meeting a lot more when we thaw out after the winter in Sweden, and that just hasn't happened. So it's just as much a sort of a lot of payments that we would normally see, and obviously we could over time also see other effects of people isolating, and that's in the older population actually joining. We had a great increase in usage from 65 to and 70 plus year olds joining SWISH if they weren't already active, and also a clear increase, a several-fold increase in the number of payments to their presumably relatives and carers to provide them with shopping. And so from my perspective, we could clearly see a change in behavior from the recommendations and other events in the world.
Maybe you can comment on this, Robin, and then I'll come to Rasmus to see the perspective from DNB. But you know, from a personal perspective, I mean, I've been locked in for almost 3 months. I'm in Poland, and the savior for me is the internet, and particularly Amazon. And I think it's interesting that online to offline has really taken a surge when you're locked in at home. You know, the home delivery service, so you don't have to go out, is critical. And that is a completely new business model, but it's also a complete change of behavior in shifting people to be forced to move to online and in-app payments.
Yeah.
What would you...
Yeah, that's another thing that we could see. We had a huge increase in just a couple of days. We saw a great increase in the number of businesses that wanted to join SWISH and be able to accept SWISH payments. A lot of innovative solutions to use SWISH because it's a true touchless, touch-free payment method. So and for sure, and businesses adapting to no physical interaction situations. That for home delivery is one example, but also doing business from back windows in the kitchen of restaurants and stuff like that. So a lot of creativity, and SWISH is, of course, I wouldn't say low tech, but a low threshold implementation of cash replacements, and so that we could clearly see that. And we have seen, when it comes to home delivery, that's of course an area that has seen tremendous growth in payments over the last months.
Rasmus, is Norway the same? And from a VIP's perspective, did you see the same as SWISH? Or there may be slight differences, I guess, going to my point when chatting with Christina about Sweden had a very different approach to Norway.
Yeah, but I think in part we've seen the same and maybe a bit accentuated. So for VIPs, of course, they have the national scheme as well, Bank Accept, which is a good representation of what happens in store in the physical retail. And we have seen sort of obviously a big drop, certainly in the certain areas. I mean, obviously those who have been closed by the government, there's been a drop to zero, right? But there's also some interesting other trends that you see. People go to the grocery stores less, but they obviously have a higher basket when they do go less, fewer times. Obviously the shift also toward home delivery of groceries and pretty much everything is also seen. And what I've found interesting is to see the innovation going on in also smaller stores. So even stores that do not have an e-commerce side, they have been in contact with VIPs, trying to set up just sort of a VIP space. So there's an ability within VIPs that you can, make a small menu and you just click through what you want and you can have it delivered. Oops. And we'll go through in a cooperation with Posten or what have you. But also there are stores that do home delivery themselves, and they will have VIPs as part of that solution. So some very low tech, you dial us, you pay through VIPs, and we will deliver it or we'll send it through the post to you. To the highly professional ones that, let's say the biggest, what would it be, electronic consumer, retail outlet in Norway, they started drive-through. So you order it online, you want it right away, but you pay with VIPs and they load it in the back of your car. So you simply just drive through the back of the building and they lift it straight into your car. So there's all these kinds of innovative, not high tech, combined with the trend that we've seen previously with the increasing on the e-commerce side, which has just obviously exploded through this crisis.
And I know that SWISH and VIPs were both very highly used and engaged already in Sweden and Norway, but did you see a similar thing to what Robin was saying in terms of VIPs usage and signups and downloads, massively spiking in March?
I think that I think it's more in terms of how it's been used. It's already a very large market penetration. So I don't have those. I mean, from what I've seen, it's not like it's a huge additional download because they already have most of the market. So it's more in terms of the fact that it's branched out on the business side and various other uses. So clearly the B2C side has grown a lot through this crisis in many ways, some high tech and some very low tech, but still using that tech in between.
And just before I come to Trond and Gijs, maybe Christina, Robin and Rasmus, can you just give me a quick view, starting with Rasmus, around, do you think that, this is only a couple of months now that we've had this ongoing lockdown in most countries and social distancing and change of behaviors. Do you think the change of behavior is just going to be during this period and then we'll revert back to the way it was? Or do you think people will actually fundamentally change the way in which they buy and pay?
I mean, for sure, it's the $1 million question. And I very much concur with what Christina started with, is that I have most belief in the trends that we already saw prior to COVID-19 and how this has been accentuated through the crisis. Because you mentioned cloud in the beginning, right? If one thing is how it's being embraced by banks, etc., but if it hadn't even been at the level where regulators would have allowed it, it would not have been possible to scale it anyway. So it needs some level of maturity, some distance. If you look at the capital markets, what was done at WeWork, Uber, some of these challenges in terms of just growth for growth in users versus also looking at the profit model. Obviously we've seen that accentuated through the crisis. On the payment side, So there are certain things, if they were a trend before, I believe that the sustainability of them will be much stronger afterwards. When it comes to travels, I think Norwegians living with the Northern Lights you have beautiful in your background, they will still want to go back to Gran Canaria Islands or where have you at some point of the year. It will probably be more expensive. There'll be more space in the plane, all these things. But some of these trends that are sort of forced upon us now, and we think, we will love Norway forever and stay every summer here, I have more doubts about them. So clearly it's trend by trend, but I believe fundamentally that when you're in the middle of a crisis, you very often see the arrows keep going the way that you believe them going. It's like when everything is looking good, you consider, well, we'll continue that direction, and when it's looking gray, we think about everything continuing downward. And I also always caution myself on coming to those conclusions too early. So it's hard to say I'm happy to go to sort of trend by trend, but on the sustainability of trends, very much depends on them specifically and how much we've felt the benefits when it's been forced upon us.
What do you think, Robin? Fundamental shift or short-term change? You need to unmute, by the way.
Yeah. Yes. I can just agree. I think many of the things that we've seen gone missing from our data, at least, those will return, provided normalcy returns. But when it comes to these new innovative ways of solving problems, I'm really hoping, I am expecting that many of the sort of good enough, least amount of resistance, minor annoyances solutions will become sort of be exposed in this when more people have been introduced to more modern, I would say obviously better customer journeys, and that will indeed change behavior. We have been introduced out of necessity to a lot of sort of ad hoc payment scenarios and solutions to problems, and I think some of those are maybe less than ideal, but they have given people a taste of what cashless or more sort of more interesting customer journeys, how they could look, and those things I think will be true shifts in behavior. And I would expect these the trends in e-commerce, for example, and home delivery to remain and endure even after the crisis.
Did you want to add something to that, Rasmus? You need to unmute.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to hit the space bar. Just a small point, but I mean, once you've tried Amazon Prime and next day shipping, once you've done digital signing of your loan documents, etc., the next time you don't get it, you get frustrated. And so there's something about this where you can always, where the permanent shifts are, you can feel it yourself. We can all feel it because we know that this is too good to go back from. So I think we can feel that in several areas, also on the payment side, where if it's cumbersome and difficult, but we do it because we have to now, when things get easier, we move away from it. Where it's like, why didn't I do this yesterday? Clearly, it will stick with us. And I think so. It's got a simplified way, but still.
And just out of interest, before I ask Christina the same question, is DNB moved to a work from home policy, and how's that panned out for you guys?
So we've had, actually today is the first, the second time I've been in the office. I was here 3 hours earlier this week, but we moved pretty quickly to everyone in home office. And we only had sort of critically operational important people here, customer center on the operation side, some on the IT side, but pretty much working from home went very efficiently. And so everyone in the area that I'm responsible for, payments innovation, worked remotely. And I think that was actually part of the success as well, because when we have this meeting, we're all looking into a computer and we're all looking at each other on the screen. The moment that you have 3 and 4 people in this room, and I start having this view instead of looking into the camera, then everyone at home, they get frustrated. So we actually had that experience with group management meetings when 3 or 4 that were critical, either due to investor meetings, etc., actually were in then our boardroom and had a group management meeting. And the majority, 2/3, were actually at home, and yet the 1/3 managed to sort of alienate the rest. So I think it works well if we all are digital. I think it works well when we're dealing with certain type of topics, like having a whiteboard behind us is something that can be done over Teams, but it's more challenging. So we're adapting, but I think once again, if we find a main benefit from it, we'll do it. And there are certain parts of our team as well who find bigger benefit of being at home than at work. And so you'll have maybe more flexibility in terms of being able to use the positive sides of it and working part from home more than we did prior.
Yeah, Christina, maybe you could talk about both from a payments perspective, whether you think it's going to be a long-term shift, and equally from a work perspective, do you think the banks will have a long-term shift to more distributed workforce?
Yeah, I'd like to say that I couldn't agree more with Robin and Rasmus. I think all you said is also what we're experiencing. So to start with, for payments, I'm sure that, once people have, because of the crisis, had to move into different or other ways of conducting their payments, they find out finally that it was quite handy. They will continue to use that even though the crisis is over. And I definitely, there is nothing going, there is no way, never any way back. Development is always, if you want, forward looking. So we're not going to go back just because the crisis is over. Even if we do go back to the Canary Islands, we will not go, I don't think we will go back to more cash payments. We won't go back to less SWISH payments. So I think this will just continue. And we're observing that also in the central bank community, this issue of digital payment is even more underlined now with the crisis. You would think that central banks are 100% into what kind of monetary policy measures they could implement or should implement at these times, but a lot of the payment activities are also still going on, not despite the crisis, but actually because of the crisis, because more countries than ours are realizing that cash is going to decrease also in their countries, and this issue of central bank digital currencies is becoming more and more acute to more and more central banks. So I think the last survey showed that about 80% of the central banks of the world are now conducting activities of one kind or another into the issue of CBDC. So I think we will see central banks in the payments area acting even faster. Maybe we were never really fast, but then everything is relative, so faster than we did even before the crisis. So I think the development will go on, definitely. There is nothing going back. And when it comes to the issue of how we've been actually working day to day in the Riksbank, we've had as few people as possible in the office and as many as possible from home. And traditionally, we're an organization which has not really ever believed in this working from home or working from a distance. We've been strong believers in the importance of the meetings, physical meetings, and the possibility to reach each other fast physically. And I think now we all realize that that's not true. Many things are more efficient when you're all from distance. Many meetings are much shorter today than they were last year, for example, so before the crisis.
I know that Trond and Gijs are being very patient. I'm going to come to them next, but just before I do, as you mentioned central bank digital currencies, and you are in the bank that's been talking about this for one of the longest times in Europe, when will the e-krona appear and in what form?
That's the other $10 billion question. The answer is I don't know. So we're working on this pilot together with Accenture, which was our chosen partner. Of course, that work has also been struck by the social distancing, but that work is going on, and we don't have any date when this will be launched. Instead, this is rather an internal project within the Riksbank, so it's not a pilot in the real sense of the word. It's rather a proof of concept that we're doing. We will see when it occurs and in what form, I would say. I wouldn't count on that we are the first central bank issuing digital currency. I think already someone is ahead of us. And I think many more will be ahead of us before we launch.
I had to ask it. Trond.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you, Christina. I'll come back to you probably before you have to drop off with a couple more questions. But Trond, you know, you've been listening to the other guys patiently, and I guess the themes we've explored already are basically saying cash declining, increasing use of mobile wallets and mobile payments. And from Nordea's view, you know, what are the big shifts you've seen in the last 2 months in your customer behaviors? And equally, we haven't talked much about corporate. So both consumer and commercial banking, I guess, have seen different things happening. I don't know whether you can talk to those, but perhaps you can give your perspective.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I changed the microphone. So I think as you previously discussed, I think it's a little bit early to be sure about what shift we will see. Of course, nobody maybe knows yet. And even if we have seen some changes now in transactions, I mean, both the amount and the number of transactions is down. We have, of course, seen an increase in contactless payments and so forth. But even though it's a smaller amount, when it comes to what will stick and what will not change going forward, I think we believe maybe it will depend a little bit on the different products. Like, of course, I think services like streaming services like Netflix, HBO, they will, of course, see a decrease after the crisis. Maybe banks and insurance companies with, I mean, less interesting products in that sense might have the possibility to surf further on that digital wave. But I think for Nordea, and I guess also for DNB, having not only early adapters on digital surfaces, we have kind of like the whole spectrum of customers. We see that in the crisis, the early adapters of, I mean, mobile bank and all other digital solutions, they uses this a little bit more than before. We haven't seen like the very large increase in usage. When it comes to the late adapters, we still not see the very increased interest for the digital. I think we actually need to do the job like we had to do before as well. But our hypothesis is that maybe a part of the late adapters will now try, and then we will see like post-pandemic or in the future that it might be easier for late adapters also to try out more advanced banking services digitally. And we did some research on our customers who actually are saying that they believe, about 1/4 believe that they will be more digital after the pandemic than they were before. And that's interesting to see. And this study have told us that, okay, even if we don't see the kind of like large increase in use of digital services like yet, I mean, we have of course had, as I said, some increase. We need to be doing our job, actually teaching them and training our customers to use it. But then we believe it will stick even more. So that's what we have seen now in short perspective.
From an internal perspective, did the move to lockdown and have people working from home have a big impact in bank operations, or was it a smooth transition?
I think we have solved that pretty good. in Nordea. We haven't, of course, I think the close down of schools and kindergartens in Norway maybe had a larger effect on our deliveries than actually working from home. So, but in total, I think we have solved that great, and I think that it might be the case that people maybe use that opportunity more in the future.
Yeah, I must admit, I've got calls like this on a regular basis, and then in between them, I'm playing the Incredible Hulk to two small Spider-Men. So it's quite challenging, to say the least. And I guess the question for you and also for Rasmus is, I don't know what actually happened in the Nordic region with government response to the crisis, but I know from the UK perspective, and I've blogged about this yesterday and today, that the government came up with all these stimulus programs that the banks had to give to small businesses, to the self-employed, to the direct benefits to families and consumers. And the UK banks, because the large banks have very constrained legacy systems, really couldn't respond to those requirements very well. In fact, they were pretty much a disaster. The challenger banks were much more impressive, if I'm honest. What's that been like?
I'm happy to. So from the Norwegian side, there have been various stimulus packages you mentioned. Some have gone on the sort of on the lending side, simply giving liquidity to large corporates. Others have been what's more known as helicopter money in helping small and medium businesses staying alive through the crisis with their fixed costs, such as real estate, etc. And distributing that money really has shown, or actually that whole solution proved the benefits of a digitized society such as the Nordics. When you have digital ID, when you have all kinds of tax information, like you have, for those, Altinn, you have the Skatteetaten, who has gone fully digitalized, and various other sort of core infrastructure allows us to build solutions that is not possible in the US. I was just speaking to a colleague of mine here who's Swedish, and he said one of his Swedish friends got a deposit into his US bank account recently. I still have a US bank account, and I checked. Unfortunately, I didn't get any money. But showing the inefficiency of spreading that too wide. Here, it's a solution that where DNB built the platform that was scaled to take on a large group of applicants, and where also the existing payment infrastructure provided a very smooth payout. So basically, from the inception to the first money being paid out was, 3 weeks, I believe, that it was completely done. And so that was it was also only possible due to meetings like this. Those developer teams across the various interest groups had not met physically at any point in time. And that also allowed for a speed that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, simply because you don't have to set your calendar and sometimes next week we can meet up and you travel from this part of the city, etc. You just immediately come together and you solve things and you move off. So some of you pointed to the efficiency of these meetings. That's the benefit. Of course, everyone's left in sort of a vacuum of, well, what about the positive inefficiencies where you actually get some information across? This is sort of meta above payments, but it's definitely, it's highly efficient, but you're definitely missing something. But specifically on the solutions that has been provided by the Norwegian government, they've been seen as highly successful, and in large part due to over time building common infrastructure by the government, between banks, etc. And I think this applies to the whole Nordics. So we have a unique position here beyond many other regions of the world.
Fascinating. And I guess building on what you just said, Rasmus, I'll come to Gijs, because I said I was just doing this study on what the post-crisis pandemic crisis will look like from a payments perspective in Europe. And I've been interviewing various people, and one of the nightmare stories I heard is a friend of mine who's in Shanghai in China. He's an American working there, and they've just come out of the crisis. In fact, he wasn't really affected by the crisis because when it came, he was in Thailand and celebrating New Year with his wife's family. And then by the time that the crisis hit Thailand, flew back to Shanghai when it was just opening up. So he's been okay. But he told me one thing which amazed me, and that's that his American bank isn't geared up for doing SWIFT transfers to China. So what he has to do is go to the American bank branch representation in Shanghai and get money out of the bank in Chinese renminbi and take it next door to his Chinese bank and deposit it to get money into his Chinese bank as cash. And it's the only way he can do it, which shows how antiquated American systems are, as you mentioned, the US, Rasmus. But Gijs, you and I have spoken quite a bit about the trends. And one thing you mentioned, which I found really interesting, is talking about the acceleration towards cashless in the Netherlands, and from the Netherlands perspective and then a wider European perspective. Can you give a view around, obviously, what you've heard, but equally other things you're seeing happening?
Chris, I'm not sure, because the connection was a bit crappy when you asked the question. Were you asking about the situation in the Netherlands? Is that what you were saying?
I hope the sound recovers. I was just saying that when you were talking to me, you mentioned that there's some key numbers showing the acceleration towards cashlessness in the Netherlands. Yeah. Perhaps you can reference that and then talk about the wider view of what's happening in Europe.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. But before I do that, I'm just I think the Netherlands, to start there, are in the Eurozone look, I think, most like the Nordics in terms of efficiency, payments, behavior, and so on and so forth. I can confirm everything that has been said in terms of payments behavior. Especially, we have something similar to, let's say, SWISH, which is called Ideal, which is soaring. Of course, not everywhere, not in the hotels and the airline branches, but volume soaring 40% as opposed to last year. Indeed, home deliveries and so on and so forth. It's all the same picture. And when Christine talked at the beginning of the webinar, it came to me that the crisis, that one of the roles of central banks is being a catalyst for change. And indeed, this crisis is a catalyst for change. And it indeed reinforces, I believe, the trends that were already there and are being leveraged. Of course, payments are always derived from actual behavior in the real economy. So, I mean, all we do in payments and everything that's happening in payments is a reflection of something that happens in the real economy. People staying home, people changing their shopping behavior, etc. It's not, I mean, payments in abstract or in isolation that changes, because people's behavior in terms of mobility or shopping or whatnot changes, and as a consequence, payments behavior changes, I would say. So indeed, we've seen, if coming to cash, we are still at, let's say, little over 30%, at least end of last year, cash transactions at the point of interaction. That's not the same thing as the amount of cash in society. We always gauge the card payments versus cash payments at the point of sale. We've seen it already. The latest figures, I think we're already at 25%. It's accelerating, and we have a sort of fundamentalist discussion. Indeed, comes back to something the discussion earlier. Is it going to be a lasting change in behavior, yes or no? Some at our central bank still dream that after the crisis, people will again go to ATMs and withdraw bills and carry them to physical shops to pay in cash. Honestly, I do not see that happening. It has been said. It's the same thing if you want to give up smoking. You just need to not do it for 48 days, I believe, and then hopefully your behavior will change in a lasting way. That's the same with payments, of course. So I'm a real believer in the effects of the crisis as they are reflected in changing payments behavior, that they will be lasting. And of course, there will perhaps be some people. We talk to the Italian colleagues. We have a weekly call with our Payment Systems Committee at the European Banking Federation, and when we had this discussion, the Italian colleagues still believe that people will go back to cash. So in some countries it may be, but not in the Netherlands, and indeed I would say not in the Nordics. as we entered the crisis, we were just sort of re-gauging the. We have a social forum on payments presided by the central bank, where all stakeholders in payments sit together and discuss payments issues. And we were just revisiting, reviewing our view on the role of cash in society when the crisis hit. And of course, the ATM volumes halved, and people started, indeed, even the elderly people that didn't use cards stepped from cash to contactless for obvious reasons, of course. And this has led, and we're just in the middle of this, there's going to be a meeting in 2 weeks, that we say, well, we think we are already entering the end game of cash, something we thought that wouldn't happen for, let's say, 3 to 4 years to come. But we really have to start a project to rethink what the final, in the end state, the cash infrastructure in our country will look like. Because the way we look at it now, we think that in 5 years' time, we will come to, let's say, Nordic levels of possibly 10 to 12% cash payments at the point of sale. And what sort of a cash infrastructure do you need to support that? And is cash then still, there's another discussion with the central bank, is cash still a fallback option when electronic payments should go down? Also within the central bank, to be honest, there are different schools. So the people that are responsible for banknotes have a slightly different view than the guys from the payments policy departments, who just at the same time published a report on CBDC. And I confronted the banknote people with one of the headings in the report of their colleagues from the payments policy department, which is cash is no longer king. So, I mean, what are we talking about here? Same central bank, 2 different departments. Yeah, and yet again, and that's the trick. Even if it's only 10%, there are fundamentally there are rules like privacy, and people that for whatever reason do not want to use cash or cannot use cash. It's still a legal tender, and as long as there's not a CBDC, cash unfortunately still has a role to play. But we believe it will only in terms of transactions. So we're not talking about hoarding, because we saw and still see the amount of cash going up in society, in circulation going up, but it's not being used for transaction purposes. People put it under the mattresses because they don't get interest from their banks, which is not a very wise thing to do, but they do. I think, and the Nordics are always a very good example. We do one thing differently. We talk about it. How do we do it together? How do we do it jointly? We do not want legal obligations to accept cash, as in some Nordic countries is the discussion going now. So we want to together with all stakeholders, in a controlled way, carry, let's say, cash to its final place. Was almost saying to the grave. It's not going to be the grave. It's not going to be dead for 5 years. But the question also remains: what is it and whose problem is it anyway? The cash disbursement. I mean, it's the banknotes belong to the central bank, right? It's not the commercial bank. So we are also going to have a discussion in this survey, this new investigation we're going to do. Whose problem is it anyway in the end state? Is it the commercial bank's problem? Because we are now carrying the cost of the commercial banks, or is it the government's or the central bank's problem? And is it a universal good, and should the government pay for it? So you run into that type of discussion. I'll stop there.
That's good. There's a couple of questions that have come up. One in particular around how the crisis is changing international payments. Ordering goods between countries. Do you see any impact that's come through since this started around that infrastructure or logistics?
Not really. I think in general, I think it was one of the panelists said it before. In general, and I keep telling people same thing as the last crisis. These payments infrastructures, they are quite robust and resilient, even if banks may have legacy systems like in the UK. But basically, transaction bankers are a different kind of animals. They are the guys in the basement doing the plumbing. They got us through the last crisis, and payments are not the problem. The payments infrastructure is not the problem. it's working fine. So the payments have never been, well, as far as I can remember, not being the problem. So especially in Europe, in SEPA, I haven't heard of any problems. And indeed, if you go intra-regional payments between the European Union and especially, of course, the US, well, you gave examples, and China for that matter. But there also, I mean, I can pay with Ideal on AliExpress. I mean, there are the P-Pro, it's a German acquirer. They do the integration of that payment method and many others on the websites of Alibaba. So I can just pay with my Dutch Ideal payments mechanism and order in China. That's so it's not all bad news, but especially the US, the payments infrastructure is of course totally crap. And everybody believes that all innovation comes from the US. Well, it doesn't. Yes, we have Silicon Valley, but the payments infrastructure is, of course, totally outdated. And it's well, I think it's still 400 or 500 billion checks being processed every year within the US. But they've made it so efficient that they can't get rid of them anymore. But I haven't heard of any cross-border payments problems because of the crisis, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comment you made around the last financial crisis, because in 2008, when Lehman's collapsed, one of the key things was that the central counterparty clearing structures mopped it all up. And if they hadn't been efficient, then it would have been a far bigger disaster because of the exposures that delivered. I guess final question before coming back to the other guys for you, Gijs, is, you know, as I've been watching the markets, and the guys I know, I've seen quite a lot of innovation in thinking in some of the startups, the fintech community. And by way of example, Starling Bank in the UK came up with the idea that a lot of elderly and people with underlying health issues can't get out of the house at all. So they created a companion card. It's basically just a prepaid card, but you can give that card to your family members or friends or neighbors to go and do the shopping for you, which is, you know, a very quick turnaround. Have you seen any innovative things in the payment space in the last couple of months that you'd say there's an interesting example of doing things different?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we try to sort of keep track in our payment systems committee. Of course, we monitor the contactless limits. We monitor or exchange information between the communities on what's happening in terms of cash, but also coming to your point, what are banks doing to help, especially the vulnerable people? Because typically we think about innovation to help the young and agile and tech-savvy part of the customers. But what we do see now, indeed, it's not so much rocket science innovation, but it's leveraging what we have, like SWISH and Ideal, more use cases for stuff we already have, more clever use of what we already have today. We also see that happening here, but also in terms of innovation, again, for the vulnerable groups. So indeed, the card you're using was the reason why we sort of tried to make a survey. We have a table. We haven't seen much. We've seen, of course, that example. We've seen Irish banks doing more phone banking, and budgeting tools will already sort of coming up, and we will probably see more of that. Yeah.
Trond, from a Nordea view, have you seen any interesting innovations that are responding to the needs of financial markets during the last couple of months?
Yeah, I mean, inside Nordea, we have 1.5 years ago, we introduced the possibility to do a video meeting in app, on phone, or in net bank, mobile bank, so that our customers do not need to kind of come into a branch. In these days, the last weeks, we have seen, of course, highly increase in remote meetings to our advisors. So we have now these days about 80% of all our meetings with customers are we doing remote. And this will also be, I think this will also be very good for older people that kind of are afraid getting the coronavirus, they can stay at home using, and they will still feel like the personal relationship to the bank, because they actually can see the person and talk to the person through their computer or their phone, if they are, of course, using it. So that's interesting, and I think for Nordea's kind of strategy, it's important to still be personal, even if we are digital. And in that sense, I think the video meetings have been a great success for that part. In addition, I think a couple of banks in Norway have been in collaboration with the fintechs introducing subscription management solutions in their mobile banks. Nordea did it a couple of days ago with Østbye. So now we have this possibility for our customers to view all their subscriptions and also to cancel them by a click. We have had very good feedback on that so far. And as we know, these days people are, they are going into or going out of different memberships or subscriptions, and they might be needing this possibility to have the overview, not being a kind of like just paying but not using passenger. Another thing that Norwegian banks are not very good at yet is to be able to use the data we have on the customers to help them in their personal finances, like day to day, first and foremost, but also more long term. And I think that many of the Norwegian banks are working with this either internally or with third-party fintech companies to provide this kind of PFM solution, personal financial management solutions, in their apps. And Nordea is launching such a service this spring in Norway. We have launched it in one of the other countries already. I think that will help out a lot, and it's by time, I think, we are using the data we have and really adding some value. I can also mention that we see increase in the use of mobile payments in store, point of sale, face to face with NFC technology. Apple Pay and Google Pay have increased, still pretty low spread in Norway. But I guess the pandemic situation might be the time when people see that by using the phone, you do not need to touch you don't need to touch anything about your phone in the store. Might be kind of like a good start for having that introduced even more in the Norwegian markets.
There's a whole range of questions I could ask Trond. I'll just ask one and then I'll come to Robin. But do you have any idea of the surge of numbers in, for example, the in-app video usage? Because I mentioned that it was 30 times increase in the use of Zoom, for example. Do you think there's been a 30 times increase in connectivity with the bank digitally through the app?
Well, we have had around 20% increase in video meetings. But we also have had increased usage of only phone, but that's slightly lower. So I think we have had in total maybe a 30% increase in remote meetings.
Fantastic.
In this time, yeah.
Robin, what have you seen with SWISH and what's been happening with innovation in Sweden?
Yeah, so one thing is the things we talked about earlier when it comes to more and more businesses jumping on the bandwagon as quickly as they can to find ways to accept SWISH and to adapt their businesses. also in the more sort of low tech elbow grease, just building something innovation. We've seen a lot of coordination activities where support for local restaurants, support for local businesses, support for the elderly and isolated, where just users, private citizens building applications with really slick integrations into the SWISH platforms with map overlays and identifying nearby good causes and stuff like that, where you can pay immediately and add your own local businesses. And I think that's really encouraging to see that people out there use what interfaces and APIs we have to build cool stuff. That's on the smaller scale of things. I think when it comes to the more higher tech solutions, there's a lot of it's early to tell, but we're seeing clear indications that there's an acceleration of innovation in retail. I think. I mean, we've been talking about better user journeys and customer journeys for a long time, but still, the in-store experience is the same. You go, you get your piece of clothing, you try it on in a stall, and you go to the cash register and you pay. And that's, I mean, there are so many obvious ways that could be better. We're seeing a lot of initiatives around that to improve that situation. So, and one thing I would like to sort of, there's a large retail chain in Sweden. They've just recently launched their smart shopper application, where essentially the customer handles the entire checkout process and payment process from their own phone by scanning codes and getting the receipt digitally, and everything is handled within the app. And that's, I think, those things have been maybe on the back burner for some time, but now are really moving forward in the pipe. And that's, I think, any innovation that can remove friction, remove unnecessary interactions between people. I mean, obviously keep the good interactions, the ones that build the retail brands and that build the customer journeys, but removing unnecessary interactions. That's a space where there's so much opportunity for innovation. And this is, I mean, there are time to market issues, so things aren't out obviously yet, but I think we'll see the result of those initiatives getting more attention soon.
The user handling the checkout process you mentioned by scanning codes, is that QR codes?
Yeah, so that depends. The specific implementation that I'm thinking of doesn't use QR codes, but it scans the EAN codes but there are QR codes involved as well. But I mean, those are just they're obvious other solutions to those, such as NFC and other sort of interfaces between devices and goods. But the general principle is that.
Just before I come to Rasmus, one other thing that occurred to me as you were talking is, you know, I'm in Poland, and Poland is one of the largest markets for contactless payments. But when you actually live here, it's not contactless. What actually happens is that you get to the checkout, you can use contactless cards, but then you have to put in a PIN, which obviously I'm really conscious of the germs that are coming through PIN machines. And contactless to me truly means using mobile wallets. And you know, the Nordic region, SWISH, this, you know, mobile pay obviously do have mobile wallets, but most countries don't. There must have been a surge in the use of mobile wallets during this period, because you know, who wants to use chip and PIN?
Yeah, I mean, with the SWISH for our coverage, we're still not an expected payment method in store, and that's one area where established chains have sort of built parallel payment terminals besides their usual gear, just to alleviate those situations. But I'm sure if we were in more stores, and we will be as more and more retail chains are implementing us, that will be more and more clear, for sure.
Interesting. Rasmus, any innovations of note that you spotted since the crisis occurred?
Well, there's the immediate needs. We've done the new tech lab that I mentioned earlier. They've done some experiments with facial payments. I mean, just using your face as identity. We've done a proof of concept of that before. As Trond mentioned, our customer center has seen increased use of phone to create that intimacy with our customers. But if we try to, so there are definitely solutions there. But since the panel has already discussed some of those, I'll try to take one step back from that. And I think what we're seeing through this crisis, and a trend that we saw before that I alluded to, was that the VCs in any crisis will obviously have sort of a knee-jerk reaction of pulling back, and most deals were stopped in their tracks. And then we see signals that obviously, well, their pile of cash has not disappeared overnight, but the signals is that they focus on their existing companies, they focused on growing them, and we also see that those growth companies get clear signals of profitability. And in the past, we've seen lots of innovation being driven by true innovation, but also by subsidies. Some of the business models are not sustainable in the long term, and they've been subsidized by investors who want to build a large user follower from that for that company, and then create the business model. Now is the time when the profitability needs to be seen more, and we've seen already results of that with some company or some growth companies, fintechs and neobanks, focusing more on their home market, not just having a land grab strategy. And I think that will in part affect some of that growth of innovation. It will be a balance between growth of innovation, between what can actually be served also to create profit or show numbers on the bottom line. So I think that will obviously also affect banks. I mean, if you look at if you look at any banks, but I guess the European banks are slightly less solid, a crisis like this will bring attention to other areas. So I think there will be a huge differentiation now as we go out of this, the banks that are able to keep their eye on innovation and the ones that will be forced to keep their attention other place. You can see it regulatory, as you did through the AML crisis previously, and you can see it now financially as we are progressing into this crisis.
Yeah, that kind of raises 3 or 4 themes, to be honest. And that I blogged yesterday about fintech versus banks, and the fact that a lot of the fintech community are doing innovative things, and a lot of the banks I deal with are rabbits stuck in the middle of the road with a car coming with their headlights on, because they can't respond. One of the UK banks said they're getting 10 times the volume of customer calls with 10 times less people available to take the calls, because they're working from home. Another UK bank, they had their call center in India, it's shut down. These are the big banks. Meanwhile, you've got some of the fintechs doing really innovative things, like there's another one that was issuing prepaid tokens that can be used after the crisis to save local stores. If you want to make sure that your local store survives, you can pay now and get the goods later. And there's lots of other ideas. But the other side and flip that coin, and this alludes to what you just said, Rasmus, is you've got some banks that did have a readiness for digital, and it's just accelerated digital transformation and innovation very quickly because they've now made those decisions, and others that just can't respond. But similarly, you have some fintechs that are well funded because they just finished funding rounds, and others that will be starving because they were just coming to a funding round and the money's no longer there. How do you see the landscape of banks and fintech playing out?
I think it's quite fascinating how when you look to Twitter and you look to various other sources where you see sort of the strong argument being made that, you know, this finally once and for all proves the value of the digital solution, and this is obviously, you know, the ultimate test that now the neobanks and the new digital solutions will be the end all of this. And at the same time, and obviously colored by the fact that I work in DNB, but still, we see that our customers embrace the proximity of our customer center. So you point to call volume problems, etc. We've not had the same in DNB. We were able to have people physically in the buildings, but even if they were asked to go home, they could actually be at the same number have the call center from their home. So what we see when we have these Corona desks, etc., or Corona phone numbers, is that our customers we're very often focused on the retail segment when we talk about innovation, but the market obviously we have to include the SMEs and large corporates, etc. And we see that they want to talk about their financial health with us. And sometimes it's for advice, sometimes it's getting confirmation that what they're doing is the right thing. And so we see that, I would argue if the two schools were that the pure digital is the answer, it could also be that a crisis like this proves the importance of having proximity to someone that you will trust, your assets to, either your business or your home loan. So when your home loan, you know, we had to build robots to take off the robots that came out of weird in English, robots to take off the immense volume of people wanting deferral on their amortization of the loans. So I mean, these things were solved well, and we in a way, you know, that proves that, you know, the digital solutions are there, we can adapt. But I believe that the proximity to the customers, you mentioned that they come up with sort of new solutions and having dialogue with the customers, but we also see abundance of frustration in the fact that, you know, I've been in contact with you guys and I haven't gotten response for days or weeks, you know, my card is locked, all these kind of questions where also the customer center on a pure digital way is not working either. So it's not, I'm not of the opinion that there's one definite solution over on the pure digital side either. But clearly, I think in a way the conclusion from what I was saying earlier in terms of looking profitability is that the neobanks will veer more toward the conventional banks, and the conventional banks have already for a long time been on a journey where they're near the neobanks. In front-end solutions and a way of being adaptable and providing some of those, providing for the same needs that we see are being met by the neobanks. So I think there's a journey where some of these meet at a point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, Trond, maybe you can give an observation on how you see the bank and fintech landscape post this crisis, because obviously some fintechs are going to fail. Some are saying that half the banks in the US will fail. You know, who knows? But what do you think will be the play out?
I mean, we already have seen that the fintechs alone not very good idea for most of the cases. After PSD2 applied in the Nordics and in Europe, I mean, we can of course discuss that banks weren't ready. We haven't had the best APIs, but still we haven't seen like the big growth of fintechs kind of places in the market yet. They still need to collaborate with banks that still need funding. But with the pandemic now and the future that we might guess will be more digital, I think we will be even more reliant on collaboration with fintechs going forward. So again, I think the trends that we have seen will maybe increase in strength.
Cool. Robin, just any view?
Yeah. I mean, SWISH is an interesting case because we are wholly owned by Swedish banks, and we sort of are obviously a fintech company providing a service in close cooperation with the banks. And I think one of the main things we, since we're a very consumer-facing brand, one thing we see is, of course, the importance of trust and reliability and familiarity with brands, and that's barring some bad interactions with customer service and customer relationships issues. I think the banks have enormous amounts of trust and confidence in the when it comes to handling these things in times of crisis with people, and certainly in Sweden. So I think that a good cooperation between innovative companies providing niche services to cater to consumer interests that are sort of not viable for larger banks to focus on. I think that's there's a dynamic there that's really I think profitable and good for all parties involved. So.
And Gijs, coming back to yourself again, if you have a comment around the bank and fintech landscape, but I know there's also some other things happening which are quite interesting in your world of payments. But let's do the bank fintech thing first.
Yeah, nobody has a crystal ball, of course, and it came to mind, Chris, being an avid reader of your blogs. I think the crisis is a tremendous opportunity for banks to prove they really care about their customers. I know there's horror stories, and we had exchanges through email. As I like to say, that everybody probably has his or her own near-death experience with his or her own bank. But we also see good stuff happening, banks really helping people that cannot meet their payment obligations, giving them extra time, etc., etc. So that, and building on the trust that is still there. I think if banks do what they are supposed to do, they will come out of the crisis with a stronger customer relationship than before. But that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be digital. I also think that, of course, investors will be more critical where they put their money after the crisis or in the crisis, and not just pouring it down every fintech bottomless pit. So there will be less VC capital floating around to just invest and hope it's going to fly, and probably that will mean indeed more cooperation and a more mature relationship between, let's say, the banks and fintechs. I hope it will be a sort of a normal, respectful relationship instead of looking at the differences. And yeah, so I think there will be more cooperation there.
Okay, I was going to ask you another question and do some more, but my assistant had put this down as a 2-hour conversation. It turns out it's a 90-minute conversation, I've just been told. So this is going to bring us to a closure. And so at that point, I'm going to hand back to Irene, maybe to just do a final 1-minute mention of what's next. Irene, are you still there? That's a good question. No, she's getting coffee. In which case, I'll say that we're going to actually meet again, hopefully not like this in the very near future, but if needs be, we'll meet again like this in the near future, because it does work, I think. It's been a really good conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I really thank you for giving us your time this afternoon and sharing your thoughts with our audience. I wish you well, and I would say stay home, but having said that, if you can get out, please do. And wishing you well. Thank you very much for your time today. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for connecting. And we will wait for all of you to our next NFI roundtable. This is Marisol, and I'm saying goodbye.